Hey friends, thanks so much for tuning in. You know what? Today we're going to take a break, just briefly, from talking about the economic collapse to focus on corporate tyranny, big pharma tyranny, the medical industrial complex tyranny. And joining me on the line is the wonderful writer Christina Sarich. You've seen her work posted at SGT Report. She writes for Natural Society, Waking Times, Infowars, Nation of Change, just to name a few. And she's agreed to join us here today to talk about so much that needs to be exposed. Christina, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have you. We've been following your work for a very long time. I put you right up there with other truth tellers like Mike Adams from Natural News. So many folks out there trying to do the right thing and expose the evil and the corrupt nature of the corporatocracy. And what do you think is the biggest single assault on humanity at this point? Is it
Wow,
Is it
the
GMOs?
biggest single assault. That's a great question. I do think it's coming at us from multiple directions. GMOs is probably the easiest way for, how shall I put it, the powers that be, but the powers that soon are going to be gone, are trying to weed out the population. I mean, it's a scary thing to say, but that's really the gist of it. And if you mess with people's food, if you mess with the nutrients, if you mess with the soil that it's grown in and the groundwater and pollute it beyond any recognition, then there's only going to be cancer and Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases and reproductive issues and organ failure. I mean, the list goes on and on. And then, to just tie this all into what's happening with the vaccines in California, and specifically the bill that was just passed that takes away our right to refuse certain types of medicine, it all goes hand in hand. So if they make you sick with GMOs, and obviously polluted water, polluted ground soil, polluted everything really, then the only choice that you have, if you're not informed, is to seek big pharma's medicine. And we all know that that's usually a big dollar item for big diseases. So the top three killers in this world right now are diabetes, which is caused primarily by obesity, heart disease, and then of course cancer. And those are big ticket items for big pharma, and they're also big ticket items for GMO companies like Monsanto and Syngenta and Dow and Bayer, and the list goes on. So if you even notice, Bayer, for example, has their tentacles on both sides here. So they're working the angle either way. So they get you sick and then they offer you a quote solution, but it's not really a solution. And those of us who aren't well informed go ahead and partake of that and then end up sicker, and they bleed you to death. Your bank account and probably the bank account of the people who love you is bled dry, and then you die. And that's how they want it to be. The fortunate thing, and that sounds very morose, but the fortunate thing is that we have the power to change that paradigm. And that's why I write about all of these issues.
Yeah, we do have the power to change it. And, we saw a tipping point reached with bovine growth hormone in the milk. Finally, enough people stopped buying it and refused to buy it and demanded that it be removed from the milk that finally it worked. And you can't find milk with BGH in it anymore.
Nope.
I believe BGH was one of those evil Monsanto products too, was it not?
Absolutely, it was, yeah.
Yeah.
And saccharin, and the list goes on. I mean, they've been on the very obvious side of creating chemicals used in warfare in multiple wars, but they've also made quieter killers, I like to call them, like the bovine growth hormones and fake sugars and PCBs. It goes on and on, but those are things that kind of sneak into the consumer products that we use that not everyone is so certain about. Everybody has heard about Agent Orange by now.
Mm-hmm.
And even older generations will have a hard time saying that that's not a dangerous thing. But if you don't know that your cookware is toxic or the food that you're eating is toxic, then that's a little bit quieter killer. But that's changing too. I mean, I remember 10 years ago arguing with my mom in our kitchen, who happens to be a neonatal intensive care nurse, about eating organic food. And she kind of laughed at me. She's like, "Oh, you're spending all this money and what a waste. It's not, there's no difference." And sadly she's passed, but I think she'd be really shocked to see how many people are demanding organic food now because they're starting to learn about how important it is to not eat stuff that's covered in glyphosate. So,
Hmm.
or that's grown with Bt toxins, so it's not even on the food; it's in the food.
That's right.
So,
Well, I wanted to
there
ask.
is a change.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Now, you mentioned Agent Orange, one of Monsanto's products,
Hmm.
used widely in the Vietnam War. They've also invented a little weed killer called Roundup, which
Right.
they, in all their brilliance, have decided to insert into the food on a genetic level and then repatent the food. So they want to own corn. I believe their corn
Hmm.
is, I believe the Monsanto name for the corn that they quote unquote own is Mon 183. Correct me if I'm wrong. But can you
That's correct.
explain to people? I mean, because I've used this in the past here to wake up friends and neighbors about the insidious nature and the evil nature of these companies because people don't understand
Right.
that
They don't.
the Roundup is in the food that you eat. So can you just
Hmm.
talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, first of all, genetically modified crops are made specifically to be used with the chemicals that the same companies that are developing these patented seeds are growing or selling to the world. So, one goes with the other. You can't really, there's really no point of having a GMO crop if you're not going to have the chemicals that goes with it. So that's the first thing I want people to understand, so that they can kind of follow the money trail and understand why there's motivation for there to be science that's turned on its head, or lies told, or propaganda spread everywhere about GMOs being safe. Because even if you believed that GMOs were statistically the same or significantly the same as non GMO counterparts, there's still this stuff they're using in and on food. So, glyphosate was first made popular by telling farmers that it was going to make their crop yields better, that it was going to be cheaper to grow the food that we need to feed the world, and that it would get rid of pests that often cause harm to crops that we need to eat. So, if I was a farmer, that sounds like a pretty good deal, right? So, you'd probably fall for that too if you didn't know that there were all of these other studies proving that the Bt toxins, um, and the glyphosate that's used on those crops cause cancer, or organ damage, or reproductive failure. So, when they first came out, farmers, of course, are going, like in any business, you're going to look for a way to do something smarter instead of working harder. But now that we know what's happening, that the crops are actually grown, like, let's look at Bt toxins. There's cryAB1 toxin, and this is a form of toxin that's put into Monsanto's corn. And you can't separate it from the plant. It's absorbed from the soil into the plant stems, into the leaves, into the corn ear itself. So when you eat that corn, you're eating the toxin. There's no separating it. And then now glyphosate has proven over time to not get rid of the pests, to not increase crop yields, to actually make everything much harder for farmers. And the Midwest saw a great increase of super weeds and super bugs that they really didn't expect after using Monsanto and Dow and Bayer's chemicals, Syngenta 2. Let me throw that one in there. So now they're kind of trying to backpedal, and they're coming out with new chemicals that are combinations, and new combinations of both inert and active ingredients that are even more toxic than glyphosate, which the World Health Organization just said is probably carcinogenic, but we can go ahead, as far as I'm concerned, and say that's a cancer causing agent. So, what are you going to do? Are you going to eat something that's grown over thousands of years that has proven not to cause any damage? I mean, your grandparents and great grandparents weren't getting cancer and Alzheimer's and, not able to have children, 100 years ago. And now we just see autism rates and all of it, just all of the diseases on this planet, that we're in this nation that's supposed to have some of the best medicine in the world. We just have horrible
Yeah.
health. So,
Yeah, we do.
what do you do?
We do. And, so many times I will pin the autism problem on vaccines specifically. I think, when I was a kid, there were probably only 12 to 16 vaccinations between the ages of 0 and 18. Now it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 34. I think ultimately these big pharma monsters want to make it 70 plus.
It's insane.
Yeah, and the incidence of autism when I was a kid was somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 in 10,000. Now it's 1 in 60 boys, I think, has autism.
Yeah.
It's just so horrific. And you mentioned at the beginning of the interview that the powers that won't be for very much longer are essentially trying to weed people out. Do you think that this is part of a depopulation agenda? Is it eugenics
Absolutely.
specifically? Is it eugenics?
I absolutely think it's eugenics. And if you start reading about this and you look at the roots of eugenics and the depopulation agenda, I mean, I'll give them credit. There were Malthusian. Malthus is the guy who came up with the depopulation theory that became popularized. And maybe you could say he wasn't such a bad guy. He was worried about there being too many people on this planet and it being important to limit the numbers of individuals on this planet so that we don't ruin the environment. But I think that's pretty ridiculous when you look at who actually ruins the environment. It's these humongous corporations that have been given personhood who rape and pillage the planet.
Right.
And to bring up your point about autism, I do think it's the vaccines, but I think it's a synergy. And that's why it's all, people, when they start to read about this stuff, it takes a while before you start to connect all the links together. But if you ruin someone's gut flora, for example, by feeding them GMOs, because we know that this is what happens, that the intestinal flora actually changes completely, and you actually start brewing your own pesticides inside your own body. I know that sounds crazy, but that's what happens when you eat the stuff. And you give a child, twice as many vaccinations with ingredients that are known to be toxic to the body. I'm talking about the adjuvants. Then of course you're going to create an environment that's ripe for disease. So even though they haven't completely come out with a definitive evidence, it really doesn't take much logic and much just, gathering up the breadcrumbs to figure out what's happening. So if you weaken the form of the body from the very get-go, from the immune system, then all sorts of things can happen, and you give someone an injection that is going to cause their immune system to be compromised to begin with in many cases, then you have a perfect storm.
Yeah, a perfect storm for autism, a perfect storm for cancer, a perfect storm for the,
Mhm.
the literal breakdown of God's creation. He's given us these wonderful immune systems, the Creator did, and these corporations are hell-bent on destroying that so that then we can fall victim to their big pharma, medical industrial complex solutions, really the Rockefeller solutions, right? I
Exactly. The
think
Rothschild and Rockefeller, the medical mafia, as I like to call
the
them.
medical mafia, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, I want to play this soundbite from Bill Gates. It's from a TED Talk that he did, and
Mhm.
it goes a little like this.
The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
So, Christina, I just want your opinion on that because is Bill Gates? First of all, I think I understand his family ties. His father was played a big role over at Planned Parenthood back in the day. I think I understand his ties to eugenics. I certainly understand his ties to the world's most powerful people. Is Bill Gates actually saying here that vaccines will help cull the population?
Well, I think in a twisted way he is, and honestly, this is what all of the people in the Bilderberg group and whatever you want to call them, the cabal, the Illuminati, Bill Gates, there's so many names for these people, but they really say things out in the open and they just count on us being dumb enough to not get it.
Hmm.
But what's happening is that we do get it. And Bill Gates will tell you out of one side of his mouth, oh, I want to eradicate polio in Africa or India. And then the Indian government will sue him because he just tested a polio vaccine on a bunch of indigenous girls without really getting permission from their parents.
And
And
gave
a
them
bunch of
polio.
Yeah. So, you can look at what they say and then you can look at what they do. And obviously, actions speak much louder. So, he'll tell you that he's trying to save the world all the time with his vaccination agenda. But when you look at what his vaccines actually do, and vaccines in general, if you really study them, I was vaccinated as a kid. And I think maybe at some point, a certain degree of vaccines might have been safe, but I certainly don't trust them now. I just had I just had a baby at 7 months old now, and I won't vaccinate him because I don't trust the CDC. I don't trust the people who are supposed to be watchdogging what's put into these products. And I know that there's way too much money at stake for those people that are in office right now to really tell the truth about them. So it behooves the rest of us to inform each other and tell each other what we know, because we're certainly not going to get that information from, the congressman or the senator or
That's right.
somebody who works for Pfizer. It's just not going to happen.
That's right. That's right. And I just want to quantify what you're saying here for people who
Sure.
think that perhaps you're just one of those fringe people. That you're saying that you don't trust Big Pharma, but let's quantify that, because there's a revolving door of fascism at the FDA. Former heads of Monsanto, former heads of Merck, former heads of these companies get important roles in the regulators that are supposed to regulate these companies. And then the FDA will say, well, Monsanto, you can present the safety data. We're not going to do it. You just tell us that it's safe and prove it to us. And so Monsanto says, oh, sure, here it's, these GMOs are perfectly safe.
There's a complete revolving door. So if from the agriculture right down through the pharmaceutical companies, there's a complete revolving door. And then you mentioned Bill Gates earlier and played that bit with him speaking. And if you look, even a lot of people, when I first started talking about Bill Gates myself in some articles, I got a lot of pushback, because people were like, oh, Bill Gates is a philanthropist and he's trying to do good things. And I'm like, you know what? I want you to really research all of the different agencies that Bill Gates funds with his philanthropic money. And you'll come to a slightly different conclusion, I think, after you just do the research, because, they kind of do some things out front and then so much of it happens behind the scenes so that they can get away with creating new laws. For example, like the Monsanto Protection Act just barely got shot down by Obama, or not by Obama, but barely got shot down. And then now we have the TPP, and, they have tentacles in every single area that I think most people are used to trusting. Like most people are used to trusting the FDA or the CDC. But I myself, after doing the research that I've done over the years that I've done it, have come to the conclusion that they're way too infiltrated to really give us an honest and straightforward answer about what any of these things do, whether it's vaccines or GMOs or, pain medications that Americans take more than anybody else on the planet. It's just pervasive. And that doesn't even really encapsulate what I think is at the bottom of all this, which is when the Industrial Revolution happened. I think we started to give some of our power away about how we heal ourselves. And, your grandmother might have given you some apple cider vinegar and said, you'll get over a cold in a couple days if you take this. And it's so simple. It's such an easy thing to do. But somehow we started to give our power away to the guys in the white coats, and we don't question anymore. And I think more and more people are starting to question, but they've just taken everything for face value because we were sold this product. And that's what the Industrial Revolution did. It was supposed to sell us products that made our lives easier. And we trusted that, and it got way out of hand.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And, one of the things, you mentioned that people are waking up, and I agree, but the fascism is so out of control, and the reason we can't trust our representatives, we know they're all bought and paid for. Most of the people, most of the Congress critters, the senators, they're all bought and paid for by the lobbyists that represent these big corporations, the corporate personhood. All these corporations care about is profit. That's their only mandate. That's why they don't care about people, because their mandate is profit. We can't trust these people, because even as people wake up, Christina, the American people are demanding GMO labeling. And the Congress and Senate are saying, we don't care what you want. You're not getting labeling. I mean, there's no better example of fascism.
Yeah, if 90%, but it depends on which poll you look at, but it ranges between 89 and 95% of the people in America want GMOs labeled, ostensibly so they can avoid eating them. And your representatives still won't pass laws that support that demand. That should tell you something,
That's
right?
Yeah.
So, and then also to add, a lot of people, when I talk about this, they'll say, oh, well, part of the reason that these drugs, vaccines or other drugs cost so much is because of the research and development that they have to do for them. And what a lot of people don't realize is that so much more money is spent on sales and marketing, or I call it propaganda, on getting you to buy those drugs than the actual research and development. So I pulled up this infographic that just names a couple of the larger corporations and what they spend. And for example, Johnson & Johnson spends 17.5 billion on sales and marketing, and research and development is 8.2. Novartis is 14.6 on sales and marketing. Research and development is 9.9. Pfizer, 11.4. Research and development, 6.6. And it goes on and on and on. So in most cases, it's at least twice, if not 3 times as much money being spent on the propaganda to get you to buy this drug or vaccine, instead of just educating yourself on how to heal your body from the bottom up and from the inside out, instead of depending on these drugs that have horrible side effects and, cause, like you said, cause autism or cancer, or diabetes, drug disease, obesity. It goes on and on. So it's all tied together. And then I didn't find this out until about halfway through the time I had been writing about GMOs. I didn't even know that Monsanto was originally broken down into other drug companies. Pfizer was a spinoff. Like that came to me as news much later in my research, and I was like, oh, go figure. So it's all intertwined.
Yeah, no, it is all intertwined, and it's a squid on the face of humanity. I mean, it's that Matt Taibbi idea of what the banks are. I mean, I think it's worse than just the banks. I mean, certainly the banks are trying to enslave humanity. I've been saying for a long time, Christina, that at this point it's humanity versus the banksters, or the banksters versus humanity, and people need to recognize that. But again, it is intertwined. All these corporations are doing their level best to increase profits at the expense of health and at the expense of humanity. And I don't think there's a single better example of how overt the tyranny has now become than SB 277, which, despite grassroots outrage against the passing of a mandatory vaccination bill in California, despite thousands and thousands of people showing up at the California State House to say, hell no, they passed it anyway. Jerry Brown signed it into law, regardless of what the people want, on the back, of course, of all the corporate propaganda trying to promote this thing. Given the fact that these big pharma vaccine companies, the companies that make the vaccines, have blanket amnesty against any lawsuits if they damage you or your children, it is the most tyrannical thing I can imagine. And I have said in several interviews now that the totalitarian tiptoe, as David Icke has called it, is now reaching an overt level where states like California are going to spark a revolution. Because I tell you what, there is a line in the sand, and the magic government needle being stuck inside your children or my children against your will is the ultimate in tyranny. And if people will stand for that, they'll stand for anything. And I think that's the line in the sand for many.
I absolutely agree. And I mean, the fact is, if you believe in vaccines or not, once a government is telling you how and what you can do with your body, whether you're going to heal your way or their way, I mean, what they took away enough rights after 9/11, and so now they're going to come along with SB 277 in California and tell us, you know what, we're sticking you whether you want it or not, whether we put some questionable ingredients in these vaccines or not. You're going to have to take it. And the fact that they're going to tell people this and then arrest people, or, criminal penalties are at stake. I mean, it's absolutely insane. I mean, if that's not enough to piss people off enough to want to do something about it, I don't know what it's going to take. But honestly, I think it will be enough. And because it's happening in so many areas, so we saw what happened on the stock market this week. We're seeing what's happening in California. Don't even get me started about geoengineering and weather manipulation and what's the drought in California. I mean, it's just hitting us from every direction. And so you have to be pretty asleep to not, go, what is going on this planet? Something is up. So once it gets this much in your face, it can actually very much be used as a clarion call to get people, out of their complacency and to really want to do something about it. And until we have this collective upsurgence, and whether it's, waking up our consciousness or actually being physical in our acts, going and sitting in front of a federal building, or taking your money out of Monsanto stock, or whatever it is that you get called to do, it's time to do it, because I don't think it can get much worse, and I certainly don't want it to.
Right. No, I agree with you.
We've all had enough.
Yeah, and I think SB 277 is waking up a lot of people. We are reaching a tipping point, because when a government, because what the government is asking people to do, and I don't care how asleep you are, you have to be suspicious of an official, quote unquote, official entity, a government agency, a government in general, saying, trust us. It's in your best interest to trust us, and we are now going to inject you and your children, because anybody with a brain, anyone who's ever read 1984, A Brave New World, ought to be able to extrapolate from that they could do very bad things. And if they want to call the population, what a great delivery system. Mandatory vaccines. Line up and get your plague shot. Line up and get your... Right. And so it's very, very frightening as they turn us all into zombies. I mean, it's really the Walking Dead scenario that I'm describing here, when a government has the power, the autonomy to give people shots of whatever they want against the will of the public. It's absolutely Nazi-esque in its scope.
It is completely Nazi-esque. And for anyone who thinks that this is a conspiracy theory, that this is what would happen with mandatory vaccines, they should just do a little research about our government's hand in biological warfare. I mean, we've been developing it. There's secret labs all over the United States. Elsewhere in the world as well, but I'm pretty sure the military-industrial complex, as led by us here in America, is probably the worst. But yeah, they've been developing germ warfare since before World War I.
Well, absolutely. But tell folks, even more specifically related to vaccines, tell people about the CDC vaccine autism cover-up. I mean, because that's a smoking gun.
Huge. So, I mean, the fact that black men were given syphilis, and we're not told what this whole program was. They were basically given syphilis on purpose.
Was that the Tuskegee experiment?
Yes. Okay. And so later we have someone from the CDC. I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name, even though I've written about him so many times. But the CDC whistleblower comes out and says, you know what, there was a connection between the MMR vaccine that's given to African-American boys, and we completely covered it up. So he was given amnesty by Obama for his whistleblowing, but this doesn't happen to every scientist that comes out. So fortunately, because it was in the CDC, I think that's a big deal, and it will help people understand that the CDC isn't the be-all, end-all of vaccine authority, because it isn't. But the fact that it came from the CDC, the whistleblower came from the CDC, is very important, because scientists have been making a connection between vaccines and autism for quite a while now. But just like Monsanto will discredit scientists that talk about anything that makes their GM crops or glyphosate something besides safe, they'll discredit them, defame them, make sure they're fired, never able to get a job in their field again. The same thing happens to scientists who say anything bad about vaccines. And that brings us, I think that you wanted to touch on this too, is what's happening with all of these doctors that are showing up dead, and alternate health providers that are turning up dead. So again, there's a pattern emerging. One of those doctors was Dr. Bradstreet, who is really well known for his work on autism. And I mean, he was found in a river with a gunshot to his chest.
That's
So,
right. That's right. And I have this article that I wanted to read to you from the Washington
sure.
Post, just as an example of how the mockingbird, bought and paid for mainstream media, delivers this kind of information to the sheeple who, don't visit Natural News, who don't visit Natural Society, Waking Times, SGT Report. Listen to this headline: "The mysterious death of a doctor who peddled autism cures to thousands." And it goes on to basically say that the people who thought that, the people, including his family, Christina, who are saying that he did not kill himself, are
Hmm.
just nuts. And basically, it smears him, smears the family. And I just want to share this as it relates to GCMAF. I'm trying to get my arms around this whole GCMAF thing. Now, this is where Dr. Bradstreet had done so much research and was showing great evidence of the potential to cure children, or at least help children with autism, with this GCMAF. Dr. Jeffrey Bradstreet has now treated over 2,000 autistic children with GCMAF, and the results are well established. Now, for 15% of the kids, it made no difference, but for 85%, there was improvement, if only a
Right.
little, and 15% had their autism eradicated, was the claim. And then Dr. Bradstreet ends up in a river,
Right.
in the Rocky Broad River in North Carolina, with a bullet wound in his chest. And
And mainstream media likes to say it was self-inflicted. So
that,
I'm not really sure how you get a gunshot wound to your chest if it's self-inflicted. I guess you could do that if you were really creative, but
yeah, but there's now since been deaths of many others, many other holistic practitioners and natural doctors, natural medicine doctors, and it's becoming very alarming because it appears to those of us in the alt media that there are hit teams that are taking out truth tellers, just like we saw with so many of the dead banksters, so many of which were ruled suicide.
I was just going to bring that up. All of the people that supposedly jumped off of buildings when some information was going to come out about LIBOR scandals and gold rigging, and it goes on and on. So, I mean, every single aspect. I mean, if there is an industry that makes a lot of money, and we know which industries those primarily are, it's oil, it's pharmaceuticals, it's
Military
genetically
industrial,
modified
yeah,
foods,
military industrial complex.
military industrial complex, the banking. I mean, the banking provides the money for the tyranny. So it's everywhere, and I'm not surprised at all. So I think the list of doctors now is up to 8 or 10. I don't remember all of their names again, but their gunshot wounds to their heads, and I just don't see this as being some fluke.
Yeah.
Um, Perhaps it is. I mean, people die all the time from natural causes and other reasons, but
Yeah. So some of them have just gone missing entirely.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. But a lot of them just look like out and out murder, like just like what would happen in wartime if you're in Vietnam or World War II. You have your enemy across the way and you just point blank shoot at them. So if someone has an authentic way to heal something that Big Pharma is going to make billions off of, you can be sure that they're either going to be humiliated and discredited first. And if that doesn't shut them up, then, there are other ways that they can do it. And this sadly is one of them. But if there's enough of us that speak collectively together and bring these issues up, then it makes it a lot more difficult for them to cull the population, especially as truth tellers and truth seekers. So
Yeah.
that's why it's important for people that do have information, especially if they're inside an agency like the CDC or an agency like the FDA, to come forward, because those people have even more weight than some of these doctors, sadly. Because people will really start to wake up, just like what you were saying about the California vaccine situation. Once you're forced to have a vaccine, or once you're forced to be strip searched without any warrant, I mean, these things collectively add up until you've had enough and you finally want to do something about it. And I think that's what's happening right now.
Yeah, and the people that work for these agencies, Christina, have an obligation to humanity. I've long said I don't know how somebody who works for Monsanto really can sleep comfortably at night unless they are completely bought into the official Monsanto spin and have drunk the Kool-Aid. I
Right.
just don't understand. And, it's not just Monsanto, is it? I mean, there are other companies involved in this exploitation of our food and the corruption of our food, right? It's not just Monsanto. You mentioned Dow, Bayer, Syngenta. Is
Right.
privately owned Cargill part of that as well?
Cargill is as well. They're actually a huge part of it. And I think, touching on what you just said, there's a bit of cognitive dissonance. And so, when you look at what motivates people to do certain things, these people that work for Monsanto or Bayer or Cargill or Syngenta or Pfizer or Eli Lilly, they have to feed their families. They have to get up and go to a job every day. But so do you and I, right? So um, you make a choice, and some of us feel more compelled than others, I think, to have right livelihood. But once you're inside of that, there's all kinds of ways that you can lie to yourself based on the lies that are being told to you so that you can justify what you do. Um, I mean, if you even look at some people who have worked within our own military, I know veterans that went to war in Iraq and would argue with me tooth and nail to the very end that they were supporting democracy. And when all of the information that came out about that war, they came home and had a complete change of heart, and now they tell everyone they can not to join the military,
Right.
or to, if they're going to be in the military, to work for good instead of evil, to be really blunt. So there can be a change of heart, even for the people who work inside these corporations, and it is confusing for someone like me to go, how does someone knowingly poison people on the planet every day and sleep at night?
Right.
But they probably have other things at stake, and if they are given an out, if they're given a way to support their families that is in alignment with, like you talked about, like God's great earth is so full of opportunity and beauty if we just embrace it. But it's going to take a wake up call first, and sometimes it's very uncomfortable. Even knowing this information was uncomfortable for me. It's not something that's easy to swallow. And then, the more you go down Alice's little hole there, rabbit hole, and the more you find out, the more distressing it can be. And who wants to think about this every day? But if you don't look at it and you keep your head stuck in the sand, the ramifications of that are much worse than realizing what's actually happening.
Yeah, and I just want to give a shout out to one of the people that we're now aware of has done the right thing and left Merck after she discovered what was going on with Vioxx and how it was hurting so many people. Her name, of course, is Brandy Vaughn, a former Merck sales rep and a really great person who was speaking out very actively against SB 277 before it was passed into law by criminal governor Jerry Brown. And now she's being targeted to the
Of
extent
course.
that she's trying to be silenced. And the suspicion is that it's Merck mercenaries that are targeting her in her home, entering her home when she's not there, leaving evidence that it's occurred and making her feel very unsafe. And she's been speaking out. And it's whistleblowers like Brandy Vaughn that are the real heroes, because even despite this chilling effect and how horrible it would be to be targeted in your own home by these people, she's continuing to speak out. So I just want to give Brandy Vaughn a shout out, because what a brave soul to be sounding the
Absolutely.
whistle on SB 277 and the tyranny of mandatory vaccinations.
And she has so much more at stake than someone like you or I, because she worked in Merck, and that's why she's targeted, is because she's considered an expert beyond any pale. And so when people like that, like when they actually come out, it's huge. It's so important. And, I'll keep doing what I'm doing, and I know you'll keep doing what you're doing to let people know. But it's when the insiders inside the industry, insiders inside the military industrial complex, inside the big pharma companies that come out, inside Monsanto or Syngenta come out and say, you know what, this is what's happening. And I can't stand by and let my fellow citizens be poisoned or be manipulated any longer. that's huge. So yeah, I commend her for those actions.
Yeah, it's just so important, and it's humanity rising. I definitely think that we're quickly reaching a tipping point where many people are waking up to the tyranny of the corporations and the tyranny of this government, which previously so many people in this country felt was a benevolent government, but it appears more and more obvious that it's a malevolent government in so many ways. And we certainly appreciate people like you, Christina, telling the truth every day and focusing on the areas you do. So I want to thank you so much for what you do, and thank you for your time. Can you point us in the direction of any of the specific websites for which you write?
Oh, there's so many. If you just Google my name, they'll all come up. But I definitely write for Natural Society, Nation of Change, Waking Times. My personal website is Yoga for the New World if you're interested in alternative healing and the body as an energy body and not just a mechanical Newtonian piece of meat.
Hmm.
There's tons of information out there, including what I write, but what other people write. So I just urge people to look at alternative media sources and, use their own discernment to see what rings true for them, but definitely to look outside the boxes that they normally put their cognition in to understand what's happening in this world and to perhaps affect change, because what you find out and you tell someone in the grocery store line or you share with your family, it keeps spreading, and then eventually this stuff won't happen anymore.
Yeah. Well, from your lips to God's ears, our guest has been Christina Sarich, a talented writer and truth teller. And Christina, thanks again so much for your time. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. And guys, I want to thank each and every one of you for visiting us at sgtreport.com. Makes the difference that you're there every day. If you stay with us, we'll stay with you and keep pumping out this information as often as we can. We're going to shout it from the rooftops. And then thanks for your support at thelibertymill.com and thephaser.com. Real news 24/7. Have a great week.